Now remember what my papa told me. Remember what my papa told me. Blasphemy.
But for them I still in the name of the Lord. Them I tell them fine. Them I
remember what my papa told me.
in the name of the Lord. While it was
we probably in hell already. Our dumb asses not knowing. Everybody kissing ass to go to heaven ain't going. Put my soul on it.
Welcome to Severe Media Network. This video is about the question, what should reparations look like? If you like the commentary, don't forget to click the like button below, comment, subscribe, and share with friends. Some of our demands in repairing the African American descendants of slaves. 1. Blacks shall not pay taxes in the United States, and blacks shall be refunded for all taxes that they had to pay over their lifetime. This shall be retroactive and intergenerational. 2. Blacks shall have ownership of 3 or more states. Because of the history of Tulsa, Oklahoma, aka Black Wall Street, that state should be yielded to the black population in its totality. As for current business owners there, they may still be able to keep their buildings and businesses depending on the goals of the whole. Only in extreme cases of an eminent domain issue will we confiscate the land or businesses. Other than that, the buildings could remain functioning and they will have to pay land and business operation taxes to African Americans. This shall happen for a couple of other states where black people dominate the population, and land unused by the U.S. and federal government. The African American population shall never pay land or property taxes to the U.S. government. 3. Historic reparations in currency should be at least 3 times the annual amount that the U.S. has given to the Jews, covering the period between 1916 and 1865. As we have been subjugated by the forefathers and the government of the United States. 4. We shall develop a police force of our own to protect our own communities. 5. We shall have our own courts and prisons. We shall have jurisdiction over all African Americans that commit offenses domestically and globally, which means that any African American that commits an offense shall be expedited to us. All African Americans currently confined in the criminal justice system shall be transferred over to our system. This includes judges, attorneys, and people that have been sentenced and are in United States custody for a criminal offense. 6. African Americans should get recognized by the United Nations as a sovereign nation under the name the United States of African Americans. Black people is a new race of people created by the United States slave trade. Blacks are neither African nor European, but a hybrid of both races. All races and ethnicities have a sovereignty, territory, and a military force to protect their land and interests. As a new race created between 1619 until today, we demand the right of our sovereignty. This may be scary for many black people because they are terrified of the white power structure. It is normal to feel fear because we are a traumatized people that have experienced domestic violence, terrorism, and murder, and absolute independence for a people who has always been dependent on the white power structure is unpaved ground for blacks. But absolute independence and sovereignty is the law of nature, a natural law of any body of people or nation, which we are. The United States should not feel threatened by our sovereignty, as we have always been the United States' closest ally. We should be brother countries sharing the same territory. As a sovereign nation, we must develop a military force. All current and former military soldiers should transfer over to the United States of African Americans military. In fact, The U.S. Armed Forces should train the United States of African American soldiers in military tactics, as they have done with several other nations and even rebels like the Contras. The United States of African Americans will ally with the U.S. to protect its lands and volunteer soldiers to fight for U.S. interests, as other sovereign nations have done. For example, Europe and Israel. However, if the United States partakes in wars or military conflict on foreign land with sovereign countries, we shall have no obligation to provide United States of African American soldiers if it is in conflict with our political beliefs or interests. In reality, the African American population in America should own half of the land and resources in the United States, because the African American partnered with the European to develop the corporation and country from the founding of this nation. It was an equal investment on behalf of our forefathers that developed the United States to be the superpower that is today, whether that be willingly or unwillingly. African Americans should have always had access to all of America's land, currency, and resources, and that is the historical tragedy. The reparations portion is simply paying an unpaid debt. The United States should withdraw from the taxes to pay the currency portion of the debt. It shall turn over 3 or more states under eminent domain to African Americans, and residents and business owners shall pay property taxes to African Americans in those states. Also, the U.S. government shall pay reparations for the continuance of the slave culture in America, which is an ongoing current practice in United States prisons. The reparations shall begin from 1865 until today. Slavery never ended in the United States. It was redefined as a penitentiary, prison, and is now called the Department of Corrections. 1619 slavery and the developments of the prisons are not a separate institution. It was the government seizing control of the industry from the hands of white civilians and into the hands of the United States government. The U.S. government and each individual state receive funding from corporations that depend on slave labor to produce products. Government employees enforce the work details by punishing the prison population for not cooperating with work orders. This results in beatings, isolation, starvation, intimidation, and the extension of prison sentences, etc., behind the failure to work for slave wages. The government captures their slaves generally by targeting vulnerable communities that have no or little political representation. The slave catchers are the policemen. Generally poor communities, but most often African Americans, have suffered this attack and heavily disguised plot to keep massive amounts of blacks in chains and produce wealth for predominantly white communities and business owners. All of the business owners that use prison labor to produce their products or services owe reparations to African Americans and any other or current or former prisoner for slave labor. The failure of the U.S. government to give blacks reparations in 1865, when slavery was supposed to be abolished, is evidence that they were not ending slavery, but reinventing a more covert form of it. It was effortless to re-enslave black men and convince the public it was because of his moral and challenged behavior and deviance to the law. But this was a well-planned strategy from the onstart. By not giving the so-called former slaves any land or money to sustain themselves, blacks had to depend on benevolent white people for work, which was in short supply. This was a recipe for disaster, with racist rights bitter over the black liberation. They did not and would not hire blacks for work, especially beyond slave wages. Black men would often be forced to steal for survival. Blacks were criminalized and rerouted to prisons to work in plantations again. Slavery continued and evolved into the prison industrial complex. Let's talk about this. Leave your comments at the bottom of the screen and share this video with friends and family. This is the Severe Media Network signing off. Have a blessed and productive day. Peace.